So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about a couple different styles of binding and a few considerations to take into account. So the first, probably the most simple style of binding is called a pamphlet stitch. And this is essentially a figure 8 that you sew through a text block or the middle of your book. And you can either put it through a cover, or you can do like what I did here, and you can hide it within the cover. The pamphlet stitch is great because it's really easy. You don't need much thread. There's not a lot of sewing involved, but it's also not super secure, and you also can't make a very large book with it. Realistically, you can only put about 5 sheets. I think I kind of maxed out at 5 on this one. You can really only put about 5 sheets, so you end up with about 10 pages or so. I guess 20 if you use front to back. But you guys can see this is not a very big book. So it has its limits. It's cool because it lays flat, and it's not very demanding. So this is a really great choice if you're a beginner or making your first book. But just know it does have its limitations, and it's not great for every scenario. So these are both also pamphlet stitch books. But these make great gifts. It's one of the reasons I have so many. I always kind of make them for gifts for people. A couple other options if you're going to make a slightly larger book. There's this style of binding. This is called a Japanese stab stitch binding. I've had this example a long time, so it's a little bit the worse for wear. This book is really small, but you could actually make this quite a bit larger. This is a very secure style of binding. You can use single strips of paper or single sheets of paper, excuse me. So you can see, hopefully, this is one page. I don't have any folds here in the spine. So if I have a certain size of paper and I don't want to fold it and thereby end up with a half of that size of paper, this is an awesome choice. There are some techniques that you can use to keep larger books to stay in place a little bit better, namely by making more stitches. For instance, on this one, I made fewer stitches, and that probably wasn't a very good call, but that's okay. I also folded my paper in half, and so I ended up with different folios, which gave it a little bit of a different look, but this is a great thing if you only want to use single sheets of paper. Now, the problem, if you can call it a problem, with this style of binding is that your book will never lay flat, right? I suppose you could crease it if you wanted to, but because you are essentially like cordoning off this whole area, your book will always have this shape to it. So if that's not something that you like, if you guys were making a sketchbook or something, then don't do this, because there's no way to work around that. It's just kind of a limitation of the style of binding, but it is a really great style, and it does have benefits like being able to use single pages. These are actually 2 different styles of binding, but it's a very, very similar stitch. These 2 books are made with a 4 needle stitch. This one's actually 6. You can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different parts to this spine. I'm going to demonstrate how to do this in a different video. But these are really great books. You can make however many different stitches you want to make, or different rows that you want to make, and you're just pretty much only limited by how many needles you have. These books do lay flat because the book flexes along the spine, your book will lay flat as you work in it, which is kind of cool. The limitation to that, though, is that no matter what, you have to use sets of folios. So you have to have multiple sheets of paper that are folded in half so you can sew through the fold. So remember, whatever size book you want to make with this, your piece of paper has to be twice as big as your final outcome. This is a very similar style of binding. This is called a Coptic stitch, and this is an ancient style of stitching bindings. It's not great for beginners because it's a little bit more complex. This is way better if you're just starting out, but it's a really beautiful style of binding. The same limitations apply, right? It's great because you can lay this flat to work across a page. But remember, I can't quite fit this on my camera, but all of this is one sheet of paper and it's sewn through the middle. So with all of these books, you have to start out with paper twice the size of what you're going to end up with. And ideally, you should know where the grain in your paper is running and keep your grain parallel to your spine. So the last thing I'll touch on with this, with all these different types of binding, also think about the paper that you guys have available, right? If you only have a few sheets of something thicker, like, this is colored pencil paper, a pamphlet stitch is excellent for something like that. If you have a lot of paper, but it's quite a bit thinner, do a stab stitch book like this. If you, if you want a book that's a little bit more workable, if you want something that you can go back and draw into, a book like this that lays flat is often a better choice. That's not to say that one of these is the best or that one of these is better than all the rest. They just each kind of have their own benefits and their own limitations, and it's up to you to decide how you want to bind your own books.